I didn't get my period until I was 25 years old. At the time, I didn't realize that that was incredibly bad for my overall health and athletic success. So I wanted to use this video to talk about my own experience with amenorrhea, why it's bad, how it happens, how to fix it, and then also go over some of the questions that you guys have asked me online. Before I really get into this video, I want to give a general disclaimer. I am not a medical health professional. I am just talking from my own experience and giving advice based on what I have been through and the medical professionals that I've spoken to. Don't just blindly follow my advice. Please involve a doctor, a therapist, a dietitian, whoever you need to properly go through this process. And with that, let's get into it. Amenorrhea is the lack of a menstrual cycle, but there are multiple types. What I struggled with was primary amenorrhea, which is where you never actually get a period, and secondary amenorrhea is when you have a period but then you lose it for 3 months or more at a certain point. Obviously, amenorrhea can happen for natural reasons such as pregnancy, breastfeeding, menopause, but most of the time in athletic cases, amenorrhea is a result of an imbalance between energy intake and energy expenditure. Basically, it takes energy for the body to release the hormones and go through the process of having a menstrual cycle. If training load is high and energy intake is not high enough to sustain that level of training, athletes can often not have a menstrual cycle. And this is because when the body senses an imbalance in energy intake and expenditure, also known as energy deficiency, it starts to shut down the non-essential processes, and the menstrual cycle is considered one of those. As most people on this channel know, I struggled with an eating disorder from a pretty young age. When I was about 11 years old, I started restricting my food intake in an effort to keep myself small, to not go through puberty, so that I would always just be on a continual linear trajectory upward in my running. And as a result of that, I never got a period. And when I went through college, I still didn't get a period. And even as I exited college and entered the pro ranks, I still did not have one. When I was in high school, the doctor just said, oh, that's a normal part of being an athlete. When I was in college, doctors did show some concern, but I was very averse to making any sort of changes to my training or my diet because at that point, the eating disorder behaviors were very engraved and it was mental as much as physical. So it wasn't actually until 2021 when I went to eating disorder treatment and had kind of confronted face on that amenorrhea was going to have some very negative health consequences down the line if I didn't figure it out now. So I started working with a dietitian and a therapist and a doctor and making changes to fix my relationship with food and also make sure that I had an adequate balance between energy intake and energy output. I initially was training for the Olympic trials, so at that point did not adjust training. I just adjusted my food intake. I started having larger meals throughout the day as well as more snacks and a higher fat intake. That was all planned out by a dietitian. I wasn't counting calories or macros. I was just eating exactly what I was told. Obviously, I was in a treatment center, so that's not a luxury everyone has, but I would say that working with a dietitian is a really good idea. And then after I left treatment and was done with the Olympic trials, I actually got an injury, and so that meant 16 weeks of no running. That time was kind of ideal for me to actually take a step back and reduce my activity and really focus on learning to fuel myself and building up my strength. So my dietitian had me doing no more than 90 minutes of activity per day with 1 day off every single week. And I wasn't really doing doubles. It was usually just one activity per day. And also practicing fueling during those activities, always having fuel during the activity as well as before and after. For me, I also had an IUD. And so in order to know whether or not I had recovered my cycle, I got my IUD removed because sometimes those can make a cycle absent or irregular. And then about 4 months later, I was able to get my period back. So all in all, I got my period about 11 months after I went to eating disorder treatment, but I also did have an IUD for 7 of those months, so it's possible I would have gotten it back sooner if I had had that removed earlier. Since then, I've been able to maintain it pretty well. I actually did miss it 2 months last year, and that was the time when I got injured. So I don't think that it's coincidental that I had one injury last year and it was during a time when I lost my period. I think that that shows I had either too much stress or too little fuel or too much training. There was just an imbalance somewhere in my life, and it showed in losing my cycle and it showed in getting an injury. When I was going through this, so I was 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, and I never got a period, I didn't see it as a problem because it was nice to not have a period. Like, it's really convenient to not have to buy tampons and stuff like that. Like, periods aren't necessarily fun, but that doesn't mean that they aren't absolutely necessary for health, because having a period means that your body is producing enough hormones such as estrogen and progesterone to have healthy normal function in the body. And one of those functions is bone health. So not having a period can actually be really detrimental to bone building, and those teen and early 20 years are super important for building bone mass to sustain through the rest of your life. So not having a period usually means that bone density will be lower, which is obviously really bad for someone who's trying to run all the time and is in a high impact sport. For most athletes, the cause of not getting a period is an energy deficiency, but there are other reasons this can happen, such as hormonal imbalances from things like PCOS or thyroid disease, or there could be anatomical abnormalities. So obviously see a doctor, but those are very low probability case scenarios. The more likely case scenarios are that athletes have energy deficiency or a low body weight or a low body fat percentage. And when I say low body weight or low body fat percentage, I mean for that individual athlete. So every person is going to vary dramatically with their genetic differences in the size and shape of their body. And so for one person, being underweight could look very different for another person being underweight. It's all individualized and not just generalized according to, BMI or something like that. Those just aren't reliable measures. Another factor that can be a big influence in this is stress levels, because running is a stress, and I think sometimes we forget that, but it's not just the races or maybe getting nervous for workouts that are stress. It is the actual running itself. It does put a stress on the body, and so when you're training at a really high level, you could be having that sort of stress once or twice a day, and that's a lot for the body to handle. That, in combination with the propensity for athletes to underfuel, makes it so that amenorrhea is a very common issue amongst athletes. I think that more and more it's getting talked about, but the thing is that when I was going through it, I wanted it to be okay. I didn't want to have to deal with a period. I didn't want to have to talk about periods. I didn't want to have to think about making changes to my diet or my lifestyle or my training, and so I chose to ignore the problem. Later on, when I got 8 stress fractures, I realized that I had to face this problem, and then when I did, I regretted not facing it long ago when I was in high school or college or any time before I was 24 years old, so that I could have had more time with having a healthy cycle to build my bones and set my body up for athletic success. So I just want to say that if you right now are contemplating whether or not you should make a change or need to make a change, the sooner you do it, the better. Because the sooner these issues are resolved, the better foundation you'll set for yourself and your athletics. For me, all those years, I was struggling with RED-S, which is relative energy deficiency in sport. I had an eating disorder, I had low iron, I had multiple stress fractures, I had trouble sleeping at times, I had depressive episodes, I was very fatigued. When I realized that I needed to fix my amenorrhea, I knew that the issue was that I wasn't eating enough to support the amount of activity I was doing. And I think that most people that have amenorrhea that's caused by disordered eating or food rules or underfueling or over-exercising probably have an inkling that that's why it's happening. But I would still recommend working with a doctor, a dietitian, a therapist, whatever you need to support you throughout this process, because it can be complicated period, especially when those thought patterns and behaviors are deeply rooted in your psychology and they've been practiced for years and years. As far as how to get it back, for me, obviously the most important thing was facing my eating disorder head on, increasing my caloric intake, and also especially increasing my fat intake. The important thing with increasing caloric intake is that you come up with a schedule of eating that will be enough and will be well balanced throughout the day, because energy balance is important, but it's also important to be balanced throughout the day. So within day energy balance is essential for having healthy hormones and a healthy cycle and improving bone density. One thing that I used to do a lot would be to eat very little at my meals and then have like a big snack before bed. I was kind of like saving calories up, but that's not necessarily good to do when you're trying to recover from amenorrhea or when you're exercising, because you want to have fuel on board for when you're doing those activities and to help you recover from those activities. Another thing is you might have to reduce your exercise. I know that many people watching this video will be very averse to that, but the thing is that in my personal opinion, I don't think you need to remove exercise. I think that if you have a training plan and a coach that you're working with, you can continue training and working towards your goals. But there might be some adjustments you need to make. Like for me, for about 4 months, I didn't do more than 90 minutes of activity in a day, and I would always have at least one day off per week. And for a while, the intensity was reduced, but ultimately adjustments are very individualized. I will say, if you're trying to recover from amenorrhea, I would suggest not doubling, limiting activities to 90 minutes, always having a rest day. And then the last one would be stress reduction. So if you are able to incorporate journaling or meditation or yoga, or even just really relaxed hobbies like coloring, painting, reading, watching TV, and just making sure that you have time in your day where you can truly unwind, I would recommend doing that and not seeing it as lazy or a waste of time, but seeing it as an important part of your training and recovery. Birth control is something that definitely has to be considered when talking about amenorrhea, because oftentimes the doctor will just prescribe the pill and say that that solves the problem of amenorrhea. The pill actually gives you a synthetic cycle, and a lot of the underlying issues are not actually resolved, so you might still not be building bone density, you might still not be producing the correct hormones, but you won't actually know because that's masked by getting a period from the pill. And then in the case of an IUD, that can also interrupt cycles, make them irregular or completely absent. And so it's also really hard to be able to know if you are on track and getting everything that you need from your food. So for me, I actually got my IUD removed so that I could get a natural cycle and make sure that everything was on track there. For an entire year, I didn't use any form of hormonal birth control because I wanted to make sure that I understood what the demands of my sport were and how much I needed to fuel to meet those demands. And I'm actually really, really proud to say that at this point, I have a super good understanding of what my body needs and how to fuel it properly, which is something that I kind of thought I might never understand. The next thing I wanted to talk about was training with a period and the symptoms. That was another thing that I was super skeptical about because I heard, PMS can be really bad, or your period can make you really tired, or you just won't want to do anything, you'll be super bloated. For me personally, I don't have extreme symptoms during my period or around it. Definitely like the week before my period, I usually feel a little bit sad, I'll be bloated, and then during my period and right after my period, my heart rate will be lower. But right before I start my period, my heart rate will be higher during activity. Those are some of the symptoms that I realize, but I don't really have to adjust my training according to my period. And the research actually also supports this. It shows that even when PMS symptoms are present, activity might feel harder, but in general, there isn't actually any negative impact on performance. If you are someone that wants to track your period and have coaching and nutrition advice around your period, I would strongly recommend Femico. This is a free coaching and period tracking app that empowers women and encourages them to train and see their period as a superpower, as something that makes them the best athlete they can be. It also brings community together and removes the stigma around periods being bad or something to be ashamed of, and really makes them something to be celebrated. And also, as I said, it is free and you can get coaching and great advice about your period. And so if you're someone that is serious about training and wants to track your period, this app is literally one of a kind and the best one out there. This is sponsored, but I also really love the app and the company and all of the motivation and inspiration behind this service. So I would highly recommend. So now I wanted to get into some of the questions that people asked me about periods and me getting it back. Was it hard to mentally and emotionally adjust to having a period? Because for this person, it was hard when I was 12, so I can't imagine what it would be like when you're much older. I really had decided I wanted to try to get it back, and I knew that it was good for me. So it was actually pretty exciting, but it definitely took me a while to feel ready to talk about it. Do pros and elites get periods, and how could they at such a low body fat? As I mentioned, everyone's ideal body weight is going to be different. It's the same with their ideal body fat, and I think that a lot of pro runners are genetically predisposed to being lean, and that's something that I need to come to terms with and accept. Personally, I definitely have a hard time always believing that everyone is getting a period and everyone's doing it the right way. But at the same time, it's totally possible that they are, and I shouldn't just assume the worst. I like to just assume that, yes, pros do get a period. That is how you are your best athlete, and they are genetically predisposed to have a low body fat percentage, and that's just how their body is meant to look. Do you think there should be education to young female athletes about periods and the importance of having them? 100% yes. I think that I had no idea how negative the consequences could be when I was going through this, and if I had had a better idea of that, maybe I would have made changes sooner. I mean, there's no telling what I would have done, but I'd like to think I would have made changes. How long after I was weight restored did I get it? And like I said, I had primary amenorrhea. I also had an eating disorder that happened before I ever hit puberty, so I don't think I could ever be weight restored because I don't know what weight I would have been at before. Like, it's not restoration, it's just like getting to a healthy weight. I don't think that it should be assumed that someone needs to gain weight to get their period back, but if that is something that needs to happen, then you have to accept that. And like I said, it took me 11 months to get it after I started trying, so yeah. And then another question was, would you recommend getting a body fat percentage test? I would not recommend that. I don't think that focusing on body fat percentage or weight is necessarily a good idea in this situation. It's better to focus on properly fueling yourself and managing your training to support your health and overall well-being. And whatever those numbers are, when you're doing that, then that's what they were supposed to be. And it doesn't necessarily need to focus around getting those numbers to a certain place. That would be most of what I have to say about amenorrhea and the topic. But I think my biggest takeaways that I want people to have are that you should not feel bad about asking and wanting more information about periods. And there shouldn't be a stigma around talking about this. Let's support each other, support women in sports, and make this an open topic so that people can understand how important it is to longevity in the sport. So, yeah, that's all for now, folks.